Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management. Glad that you are here. Fun show for us. I'm glad to be back in the saddle again after some professional responsibilities kind of took me away from all of this in the live format yesterday, but we are live and fully loaded here today. That means reaction to kind of an interesting executive order coming from the governor yesterday. We don't talk politics in our show, but when the governor does something that impacts college football, we have to address it. We'll do some of that today. I have a specific thing that I think that some of this sort of means. I will give that to you here in a little bit. Two great guests. Davin Bellamy, the great former Dog, stops by. You know he'll have plenty to say because he has every time that he's joined us. Mike Griffith today there as well. And to begin today's show, there's this. One of the greatest dogs of all time has spoken out on something that he says will be, quote, very unpopular about the Georgia offense. But maybe it wasn't quite as unpopular as this guy thought it was, and maybe it lets us in on a conversation we ought to be having right now about exactly how prepared is Georgia on the offensive side of the ball for the big test coming up 2 Saturdays from now at Alabama. That seems like a hot topic, so we'll keep that discussion going. Glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA Athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
First of all, let me say, after a little bit of an uncharacteristic absence from me yesterday, at least in terms of a live show, happy to be back doing this show again, the way that we always do. Also, coming up in a few minutes, I have a little bit of a note for our podcast audience, in particular those who listen to the show, the audio version of the show. I'll give that to you in a few minutes. Let me instead, though, begin this way. I kind of want to combine two things into one here for a moment. Sort of a look back that lingers in the game against Kentucky, along with a look ahead to the game against Alabama 2 Saturdays from now. Because as I was telling our video audience a moment ago before our show kind of officially starts, in my mind right now, the Alabama game keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And listen, sometimes maybe I'm a prisoner of the moment. Perhaps that's what I'm doing to a certain extent here right now. But as we start thinking about 2 Saturdays from now against the Crimson Tide, I think there's just a vision in which everything for Georgia the rest of the season gets a little bit easier if it finds a way to escape from Tuscaloosa with a win. And conversely, everything but the rest of the season becomes far more pressure-packed if Georgia gives away some of its margin for error this early in the season. I think the Alabama game is gigantic for Georgia. And I think given that, I think it's really important to try to have the right frame of mind. I'm talking about from the fan base at large, because energy's a little bit contagious, right? We can't quite define that in scientific terms, but we sort of feel it, we notice it. When there are positive vibes in a room, you kind of benefit somehow from that. When the vibes are negative or non-existent, you kind of feel some of that too. So I told you leading into the Kentucky game, I said, be very careful. My expectation is this may not be a great performance from UGA. I even told you why I was saying that, because I wanted to try to head off some of the negativity that might come if Georgia played a clunker in Lexington. And so that is now exactly where we thought we would be. So it's now time to kind of try to sort of fight back against some of the prevailing negativity, if you want to say it that way, that lingers after Georgia did not have quite such a great performance there against Kentucky. But here's the good news on a show like this, is that we really feel like we can create positive vibes around Georgia football without lying about the reality that everybody sees in front of their eyes. We can have an honest conversation that also works its way towards, hopefully, a positive conclusion. So that is what we're going to try to do right now. And we're going to begin with this. One of the things that came out of Saturday, a lot of opinions from people looking on what was a Georgia performance that ended up being a game far closer than experts thought it would be. And one of the guys who weighed in on this, just to kind of give you some extra context, some confirmation that, yeah, it really was not great for Georgia. It was not what it needs to be. A guy like David Pollack, one of the greatest players in UGA program history, he steps up and says, boy, you know, I've got some things to say about the Georgia offense that he says are going to be very unpopular. In fact, let me show you this from the X platform. This goes back to the weekend. David saying this will be, and his quote is, very unpopular amongst Georgia fans. I see a lot of really good players for this Georgia offense, but I don't see a lot of great. Now, David says he thought that would be an unpopular thing to say, but the truth is it got 2.2 thousand likes, 100 whatever retweets, been viewed plenty of times there as well. So maybe that assessment, harsh as it sounds, about the Georgia offense was not quite as unpopular as maybe David Pollack thought that it was. But how about the overall assessment there? Good, but not great from the Georgia offense. You don't see the playmaker emerging for UGA right now. And I think one of the things that gives us even additional context on all of that, did you see what happened in the NFL this past Sunday? Obviously, those of us who, follow Georgia football very closely, we know how good Brock Bowers is. And yet on Sunday, in an upset for the Raiders over the Ravens, Bowers reminded the entire NFL world about what a dynamic rookie he has a chance to be in that league. And if you're a Georgia fan still trying to figure out just how easily can Georgia replace Brock Bowers, when you see him doing to NFL competition what he did to college competition for 3 years, I think you're left to conclude, first of all, for Bowers, there is no higher league for him to go to than this. This is just the only league there is. So if he's just going to do that, then he'll go down as one of the all-time greats. And as he kind of does that, and having the success that he had on Sunday, you're left to really wonder, wow, and reinforce the questions of, man, exactly how does Georgia replace a guy like this? Because he was great. He absolutely was great. And in his stead, there is no obvious next Brock Bowers, either the tight end position, the wide receiver position, or anywhere else. But that doesn't mean that collectively a bunch of players together can't create something that at least helps fill the statistical void left behind by Brock Bowers' offense. And yet on Saturday, obviously, Georgia wasn't anywhere close to being able to do that. So that's one of the discussions we're sort of having right now of, well, how do you make it better than it was on Saturday? And Kirby Smart had a couple of thoughts on that. He met last night with reporters after practice, the only time we'll hear from Kirby this week, ahead of the game week next week against Alabama. But that was one of the things that kind of came up in the discussion with Kirby of, hey, is there a simple thing you can do to be better offensively than you were on Saturday? And Kirby, for the most part, sort of sidestepped that topic. This is what Kirby said about that last night.
Communication would be one. When you look back at the game, there were some major communication errors there, talking about across the front and communicating who we're working to, points and things like that, which some of that has to do with being on the road and crowd noise and everybody being on the same page, protecting the quarterback on some pressures that are really easy pickups. You look, our offensive line, when you look across the country in 3 years, it's hard to find teams that have cut one loose, like didn't block somebody. That's just, knock on wood, that's rare for us because we have a very experienced offensive line and they see every pressure known to man from us. So that's something that we do usually well, pick those things up. And they really did that well in the game. There was a couple times we didn't, and we got to do a better job of that. And we got to be able to hit some open guys when they're open, and we got to be able to do some things in the RPO game that help us. And there's some things we missed in that. And at the end of the day, when you lose momentum in those kind of games, you got to grind them out and find a way. And we did not have momentum in that game, and it made it more difficult. But when you watch that tape, there are very things you can point at and say, if we just do this, we're going to be this much better.
So I think we understand that football to a degree is kind of an interconnected sport, that how the offensive line plays certainly impacts the quarterback, how the quarterback play, that impacts the wide receivers, and how the passing game works, that impacts the running game, because if the defense doesn't respect the passing game, then they can just key to stop the run. And is that one of the reasons why it seemed like the Georgia offensive line was having some issues on Saturday? Or was the offensive line issues kind of creating a scenario where all of a sudden everything else was just made more difficult for Carson Beck and others? Honestly, as I've told you before, when I feel like I know something, I don't mind speaking loudly about what it is that I think I know. But when I don't know something, I don't try to pretend to be something that I'm not. I can't necessarily even pretend to be smart enough to tell you how to fix everything that was wrong with Georgia on Saturday. All I can tell you is that wasn't good enough to do what Georgia wants to do the rest of the year. And Obviously, it seems like Kirby Smart, kind of knows that. And to sort of go back to David Pollack's point earlier of, hey, when I look around, I see the potential for some good players in this Georgia offense, but I don't know that I see great. Well, the one guy that's supposed to be great, if Brock Bowers was great a year ago and he's no longer here, the one guy that has similar credentials to Bowers is, frankly, your quarterback, Carson Beck. And as I've said now a few times, I want to give some appropriate space for this because I do believe that Beck will play better, but I think that I think Carson needs to play better than he has through the first, 3 games. I think all of that sort of adds up to a Georgia offense that just sort of needs to be better than it has been, and Smart's diagnosis of that right there and the sort of stark, description of that from David Pollack, that what it is right now has the potential to be good, but he doesn't see great when he looks at the Georgia offense. Now, in particular, when it comes to even the Clemson game, where Georgia eventually won the game easily, but to begin the game, that wasn't a thing of beauty offensively. That was carried over to the game against Kentucky, too, where it was another slow start. How about specifically on the issue of getting off to faster starts offensively? What can Georgia do about that? And Kirby Smart also weighed in on that topic yesterday.
There's so many steps. There's tons of them. Clean up what you do it at a higher rate, make good decisions, communicate better. It's hard to say one thing on that because there's not a lot of things go wrong, but one thing going wrong can mess up a play, and it takes one person messing up on offense. If one person messes up consecutively, you got 3 bad plays. And, certainly we just got to execute better, I think, and do a good job with guys, doing what they do in practice. If we do what we do in practice and do it against good people, which they get a chance to do it against real good people in practice, they'll do it better. So I don't know that we can point to one thing on that.
So here's where I kind of want to transition here just for a moment. You're Kirby Smart on the slow starts, Kirby on the need for offensive changes. This is the prevailing conversation. We've now done some version of this for like 3 days. So we are willing to, on kind of a pro-Georgia show here, we are willing to take head-on the fact that Georgia just didn't play well enough on Saturday. We're willing to openly acknowledge that. And I don't think anybody is absolved from criticism on that, whether it's the quarterback, Carson Beck, or maybe the offensive coordinator, Mike Bobo, or the other players who play on this offense, or maybe even Kirby Smart himself. I don't think that anybody is absolved or immune from the criticism that comes when you almost lost a game against a far inferior opponent because you just had a hard time generating any kind of offense to speak of. There's plenty of criticism to go around on a day like that. But if you're a Georgia fan right now, here's the one request I would have for you. Can we just hold off on making any kind of definitive proclamations? In other words, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing what we have done, reading David Pollack's tweet, listening to Kirby Smart on this topic, and everybody openly acknowledging that's a bad game and it's got to be better. But to use that game as evidence that this season is doomed, or Mike Bobo's coaching tenure is doomed, or Carson Beck's quarterback season is doomed, that's where I would advise Georgia fans to be very careful about putting yourself out there on something that you later on don't have a chance to take back. Because when this has happened before for Georgia football fans, that has proven to be a pretty serious error. For instance, I remember going to Miami in 2021 to see Georgia in the Orange Bowl against Michigan. And there were a lot of people, and listen, I'm not trying to drag up the past and make people feel bad about what they said in the past, but there were a lot of people who were like, man, there's no point even going down to Miami. Georgia just got embarrassed against Alabama. This season is done. Well, obviously, Georgia went on to win the national championship. In 2022, after the game against Missouri, there were a lot of people who were kind of thinking, well, Georgia may have won the national championship this year, but they can't do anything with Stetson Bennett, and they can't do this, and they can't do that. Can't. And then, lo and behold, before it's all said and done, Georgia's winning the national championship again. Even last year in a season that didn't have quite the same end-of-season result, after kind of struggling games against South Carolina and Auburn, a lot of folks kind of wondered if Carson Beck had what it took to be Georgia's quarterback. And by the end of the year, Georgia's averaging 40 points per game, getting way better as the season progressed. In other words, there's nothing wrong with reacting to an individual result and saying that's not good enough. But where Georgia fans at times, and they're no different than any other fan base in this, it's just that Georgia fans are the only fans we care about. What Georgia fans at times can be guilty of doing is perhaps grabbing a negative result and saying this result is proof of everything that's going to come after the fact. And obviously that's always an error. So when I say, can we hold off on making any kind of definitive proclamation about what the Georgia offense is, what I'm saying is, can we at least wait another 2 weeks? Because I do think, and I mentioned this a moment ago, this Alabama game keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger in my mind. And I think that when you see Alabama on the road against Wisconsin, when you realize that Jalen Milroe was in the playoff a year ago, that Kalen DeBoer with a different program was in the playoff a year ago, even in a post-Nick Saban world, I think going to Tuscaloosa and winning against Alabama is going to be a really significant challenge. Now, I believe that Georgia will probably pass that test, but I don't say that without fully acknowledging just how hard that's going to be. And for those who want to make the Georgia offensive conversation right now sort of their full and final answer, can we just get another data point before some people do that? Because I think the Alabama game on the road in 2 Saturdays is going to tell us a lot about what Georgia is offensively. In fact, can I just give you a small statistical point that sort of backs that up? If you go back and look at the last 3 losses at home for Alabama, now obviously these were all in the Nick Saban era, but once again, I think it still to a certain extent kind of holds true. If you look at the last 3 losses at home for Alabama, it's Texas last year, beat the Crimson Tide there at Bryant-Denny Stadium. Longhorns scored 34 points to do it. Prior to that, the most recent home loss for Alabama would have been to LSU in 2019. LSU scored 46 points that day to beat Alabama at home. And then prior to that, the most recent loss at home for Alabama was way back in 2015 against Ole Miss. Ole Miss that day scored 43 points to do it. So in other words, the last 3 teams to beat Alabama at home had to score 34, 46, and 43 points to get it done. In other words, I really don't see any scenario out there where a win for Georgia at Alabama comes with any fewer than at least 30 points. The 34 that Texas scored last year, something in that neighborhood. I think it takes about that much to beat Alabama. And that'll be the real test for the Georgia offense. Now, on the basis of just the Kentucky game, it seems like Georgia's unlikely to score that 30-something points. But, y'all, how many times have we seen over the course of our lifespan as Georgia fans or just college football fans that from week to week, college football can provide all kinds of potential surprises? So don't assume that what you saw against Kentucky is necessarily what you will see against Alabama. But if it is, obviously at that point in time, it's going to be time to have a different conversation. But if it's not, then maybe what we saw this past weekend was a lot like what we've seen from Georgia before. Kind of a weird, uninspired performance in a game that didn't really matter as a precursor to a strong performance in the games that matter most. That's what Georgia has done in the past, and just maybe that's what Georgia's got in store for next Saturday as well. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. Great to be with you and great to be back after sort of a weird day yesterday where I had to be pre-recorded. Now, before I give shouts out and things like that, let me say something really quickly to our podcast audience. Something weird happened yesterday that, to my knowledge, has never happened before. So we post the show every day. Yesterday, because I wasn't here, I had some folks help me out with that. But just natural sort of human error, just basic mistake. It happens. Obviously, I make mistakes all the time. The podcast was posted and listed as private, which I don't even know why that's an option, but obviously the platform where we post it has the option to list it as private. And so the show got listed as private, which means that if you're a subscriber to Apple or Spotify, you didn't get that. Now, this morning, I was tipped off. My brother actually let me know that it wasn't up there and running. Some folks had told him about that. And so I went in there and I changed it to public. What I don't know is that going to show up in your feed now or not? I don't. To my knowledge, this never happened before. Maybe the moment I made the change, maybe it got sent to your feed, but I just don't quite know. So if you missed yesterday's audio version of our show, you wonder why you did. That's what happened. We had the show. It was up there for you. We just made a mistake in terms of how we distributed it, but that should be corrected now. So if you don't see it pop in your feed, do you mind going in manually searching for that? You should be able to find it. And I know that's kind of complicated, but that is the story there on that. What is not complicated are our friends from Breda Pest Management, because they do great work as the official pest control providers of UGA Athletics. Matt and the whole team there, terrific Georgia fans, love being around Georgia football. They love local sports in general, big part of our high school football coverage there as well. But most importantly, they love providing you an incredible service here right now, not just when it comes to like bugs and critters and termites, both inside and outside your home. I'm talking about the service of putting more money back in your pocket for the things you're already spending money on. You've got termite protection as a homeowner in Georgia. You have to, because termites are a fact of life here in our state. If you haven't had them, you will. At least that's kind of the theory. But when you work with our folks at Breda Pest Management, they have the proper defense against all of that. And they're better, they're more skilled, more trained than the company you are probably working with already. But in addition to that, you can put more money back in your pocket just for making that switch to Breda Pest Management. So please do that today. Find them online. It's BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A, BredaPest.com. Right now, it's one of those times when if you can find a way to save money, you owe it to yourself to do so, and that's what Breda gives you a chance to do. So make a switch to them when it comes to your termite protection for bugs, critters, and everything else. Online, BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A, BredaPest.com for more on that. All right, I was going to do something on our DawgNation Invasion. Let me save that. I'll get to that here in a little bit, reminding you about your chance to be a part of that with us. We'll hold off on that at least for a couple of minutes here. But prior to all of that, and talking to Mike Griffith, and by the way, another great appearance from Davin Bellamy coming up later on today there as well. Let's also get ready to go around the doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at the Georgia Farm Bureau. And yesterday we got some interesting news. Speaking of Georgia Governor Brian Kemp issuing an executive order. And I'll show you this on the screen here for a moment. So it's one of those deals where you got a lot of whereases. In other words, the basic premise of the executive order says, regarding fairness to Georgia's student athletes and compensation for their name, image, and likeness. Then you have whereas. So a lot of this stuff sort of ends up feeling like a lot of legalese. But the basic gist here is that the executive order from the governor yesterday takes precedent over any kind of SEC, ACC, or like NCAA oversight about compensation for players. Right now, NIL has sort of always been kind of a third-party deal where the schools themselves could not directly pay the athletes. But ahead of a brand new landscape, once this House versus NCAA settlement can be agreed upon, is now going to open the door for schools to directly pay their athletes through the revenue sharing model that's going to be put in place. And so, in so many words, the executive order from the governor yesterday just simply gives you, I guess, a fast start on that if you're Georgia or Georgia Tech or presumably even Georgia Southern and Georgia State and all those programs, about paying athletes directly from the athletic department coffers. So that's kind of the deal. Some of this is still a little bit murky and probably in terms of some of the overall details. But one of the things that we do know for sure is that both Georgia and Georgia Tech are probably happy about it, because Jay Batt, the athletic director at Georgia Tech, and obviously Josh Brooks, athletic director at the University of Georgia, they came together for a joint statement right after the executive order, almost making you think they had some idea that perhaps that might be coming. And then Kirby Smart last night offered his thanks to the governor, who's obviously a well-known Georgia fan, offered his thanks to the governor for Governor Kemp's, I guess, a willingness to sort of step in on this particular topic. In fact, this is what Kirby Smart said about that last night.
Appreciative. Want to be competitive as we can be in our field of endeavor. This world we live in, and it's not just us, apparently. I mean, it's the whole state of Georgia, USG, and very appreciative of Governor Kemp and his staff for allowing us to be competitive and putting us on a level playing field and to continue to support our student athletes. This is going to benefit the student athletes, and very appreciative of them supporting that and getting it done.
Watching on YouTube, one of our commenters named KC said, hold on, I thought players were already getting NIL, which is a very fair question. A lot of this seems a little bit confusing. However, there was something else that Kirby Smart yesterday said that I think gives you a little bit more, I guess, insight into perhaps what all of this is actually about. Listen closely to this line from Kirby Smart and see if you recognize what I recognize. Here's Kirby Smart.
I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that. I mean, it's all about what you have available, right? And some people are willing to spend beyond their ability to raise it, like unfulfilled promises. Like, we're not going to have unfulfilled promises where guys reach back out and say, well, they said they could do this and they didn't. They said they could do that and they didn't. So we've lost some in those regards, but I don't know that it was an inability to do it. It was not going to go step over our skis and like put our body over and put too much out there and say, okay, we've committed to this and you can't do it. So it's a hard world out there because you don't really know what you can and can't do. People make promises and there's no, nobody has a bounty sitting out there that big that they can pay everybody that. And so, you try to be judgmental. You try to make good decisions on players. You want people in your program that really not making it about just that. Because when it's just about that, it'll never stop. And that's not going to change based on what the governor does. I mean, with the governor's thing, it's not like it's going to be this open surplus. It's just helping us, be competitive with others. And I'm sure Georgia Tech feels the same way. You're out there competing in a really competitive environment, and there's times you feel like you want to do something and you can't. And now, hopefully, we've got the capabilities to do what we need to do.
So the question there was about, have you lost recruits because of the NIL laws that were in place prior to this? And Smart kind of gives his answer to that. But it's the statement that he makes about, hey, there are programs out there that are spending more than they're raising. That was the part that sort of jumped out to me, because I've told you that before, that it's obvious that a lot of these collectives are operating with a very high, what you think of as like churn rate. They are burning through money in the hopes of kind of building some momentum for something that maybe becomes sustainable later on. A lot of companies operate this way. A lot of the collectives, I believe, have sort of operated in that fashion. And the truth is, I'm just not quite so sure how well that's working. That I think one of the worst kept secrets out there is that a lot of these collectives, I have no idea what the Classic City Collective, but a lot of these collectives across the landscape of college athletics are just this close to being insolvent. And so what I think happened yesterday by the governor doing what he did, it sort of created an issue to address the supply side of the NIL story. See, almost everything we ever read about NIL is about NIL demand. Demand from the players to get it, demand from the programs to have access to it. But there are just very few stories that ever get written about NIL supply. Well, now for Georgia being able to pay their athletes directly ahead of whatever happens with this House settlement, well, that kind of goes to solve maybe the supply problem when it comes to some of the NIL money, because obviously the athletic department has a lot of money. And where I think this could actually benefit the average fan here a little bit is, you've been asked to contribute NIL before without really getting much for your efforts. You don't get like additional sort of credit from Georgia for better tickets to home and away games or, special status like McGill Society. But now that this is going to be seemingly taken in-house, and now that money you give directly to Georgia can end up in the pockets of these players, all of a sudden now for your contribution, Georgia may give you something for that. A little bit like the creative way in which they've kind of made the McGill Society kind of a popular thing. You get a chance to go see one of the practices, or some of the stuff they did with this year's gala where you had a chance to be a part of that and sit at a table and have access to a lot of Georgia players, or like the Classic City Collective practice that took place back in the summer, that it's going to be costly. There's going to be a price associated with this. But if you want more access to Georgia football, better tickets, more opportunities to meet players, get autographs, things like that, bringing this in-house, if I had to guess, might be a way for you to get a little bit more of that. And as everybody sort of wrestles with, how do we get the money to pay the players to be competitive in the future, by the governor doing what he did yesterday as it relates to UGA, maybe it just gives them a little bit of a head start in trying to figure all of that out. And that is Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. Now, speaking of supporting the great state of Georgia, our folks at Georgia Farm Bureau are all about that all the time, living and working and just doing life right here in Georgia. That's why we say that Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team. And if you want to find out how true that is for yourself, why don't you check them out here today and understand why, when you're facing all these choices for what the right insurance provider is for you, that Georgia Farm Bureau is just a great name to consider on that for all the reasons that I just mentioned. Good, friendly folks who kind of Understand why your vehicle is important to you. It's what you use to get to work every single day. And when that's broken, you're messed up. And that's why your auto insurance coverage is so important to you, or your home insurance, kind of the same type of thing. Big investment, source of all your emotional kind of needs there too. Your home matters to you. So protecting it with the best possible home insurance, that matters to you there as well. Our folks at Georgia Farm Bureau understand that too. So I want you to reach out to them and give them a call, 877-404-1050. That's 877-404-1050. Or find them online at gfbinsurance.com. Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team. All right, so before we're done today, the great former Dawg Davin Bellamy, always fun. He's going to join us on the program. But for now, on everything happening around UGA, including what exactly did go down with this executive order yesterday, let's talk about all that and more with Mike Griffith here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So Mike Griffith joins us here now. We'll get into the Georgia stuff as it gets ready for Alabama here in a moment. But how about, Mike, on the topic I was just addressing? I kind of had my turn on that. To me, the tangible benefit to Georgia from the executive order yesterday is more about the NIL supply side here a little bit, that when Georgia can now pay these athletes directly, that's just sort of a bigger pot of money. It is very hard to raise large sums of money on the back of small donations. Every collective deals with that to a certain extent, but obviously you don't have to worry about that quite as much when it's from within the athletic budget overall. I know that's kind of tedious, but I do believe this was sort of a step in the direction of saying, okay, now we're going to use our sort of biggest coffers of money as a way to start getting ready to pay these athletes and get a little bit of a head start on the fact that everybody's going to be doing that within the next, year or so. That's sort of what I got from this yesterday. Did you get, I guess, anything different from that or in addition to that?
I mean, along those same lines, Brandon, I think donors would rather give to the school than give to a collective. I feel like that's probably the biggest thing, is it kind of takes the middleman out of the process and gives UGA more direct control. And I think donors have more confidence and more comfort giving to the school than giving to a third party collective. So it's really more of a, I think, kind of taking a bug or a kink out of the operations side of that. I mean, everyone's trying to make the perfect wheel here. This is uncharted territory. Everybody's trying to figure out what can you do legally, what makes the most amount of sense, what greases the skids. As you've seen Tennessee, now they're adding a 10% luxury tax, I guess, for performance because they're doing so well. I mean, could that be coming to Georgia? I don't know. It really is pay for play. If your team's doing well, maybe ticket prices go up the second half of the season. At some point, we'll hit donor fatigue. At some point, we'll hit a wall. I keep saying it. This is going to come down to corporate sponsorship, much like the NFL. We're not there yet. But right now, Georgia, I think one of the top 5 or 6 collectives out there based on some information that I've gleaned behind the scenes. Certainly not at the top, but competitive enough to have enough money to pay for players to win championships still.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I kind of briefly mentioned this a moment ago too, which is the problem with the collectives, and I'm not talking about the Classic City Collective, I'm talking about just collectives in general, is that if I'm a fan, I don't get anything for giving to the collective. I may get a sticker, I may get a hat, but if I give to Georgia, I get better tickets. I get a chance to go to practice, which the Classic City Collective did offer this year. Like, there's just always been a much greater incentive structure for giving to the Athletic Association. And because NIL had to be third party, you couldn't get any of that the way that you traditionally had. So I think if you're looking for a simple takeaway on this as sort of the average fan is, and it's all going to be pricey and it's all going to be expensive, but now when you do give something, you may get something for your gift, which I think kind of takes us back to probably a pretty good direction, even if it is sort of expensive overall.
Yeah, and I wonder if the average fan gives to the collective. I mean, what do you think we're talking about, Brandon? Maybe 1 or 2 people that can afford to give money for Georgia players rather than pay taxes and bills and buy houses. I mean, it's a pretty exclusive club that has the finances and enough extra money to give to random football players and cars rather than their own children and homes. So I think we're talking about a select few, but yet it is that select few that funds these programs. I mean, these are the people that give the money that enable Georgia to have an elite practice facility, or enable Georgia to pay coaches top dollars, or been able to go out and pay for players like Trevor Etienne or Benjamin Urasek or whomever they get through the portal. I mean, look at Ole Miss. My goodness, I think they've only got 4 players in their starting lineup that aren't transfers. So there's some programs that have given more than others. I heard Hunter Urasek, the Arkansas representative, talking the other day about, if they could just get, 1,000 people to give $100 or, something to that effect, something that simple, right? And how many people Ole Miss had involved versus Arkansas and how hungry are these programs? It just, to me, it's still a challenging model in terms of the sustainability of it. I think the fans are already paying a great deal out of their pocket. And yet, and still, at the end of the day, this is coming down to an arms race and a money game. And although Nick Saban did say, with that $20 million, I don't know if we're going to call that a salary cap or $22 million, you better get the right guy. So there's a lot to this. There's a business side of this. There's always been a business side. It was just in the underworld. People didn't talk about players getting played. But now that it's above board, we're seeing a lot of creative marketing and certainly the steps that were taken to Georgia yesterday kind of grease the skids and catch Georgia up with a lot of other programs, that have been ahead in this capacity.
Obviously, there's been a huge conversation going on after a game against Kentucky that was probably not as pretty as it was supposed to be. Seemingly a lot has to go wrong for Georgia to play that close of a game against the Wildcats. So, Mike, from your perspective, what went wrong for UGA?
Well, Brandon, I know you looked at the same historic data as I did. In fact, I think you were the only one that actually picked Kentucky to cover the spread. You saw the trouble that Georgia has historically had at Kentucky. Those were some of Stetson Bennett's worst football games. If you look at the numbers, Georgia has not put up a lot of points. And a lot of that has to do with Mark Stoops and the way he plays football and the way he understands how Kirby Smart plays football. Now, all that said, let's face it, Carson Beck didn't perform well. Kirby mentioned yesterday, you got to hit open receivers. We didn't see that leadership. We didn't see that assertiveness. We didn't see that charisma. Carson Beck put the team on his shoulders. Now, to be fair, I don't know that he was in position to. I think that game plan was geared for field position. And had Jalen Walker not been called for a controversial personal foul, they flipped the field position. The plan works. Georgia probably scores. Instead, Kentucky's able to flip the field. So this was an old-fashioned knockdown, drag-out, slugfest. Let's face it, Tate Ratledge gets knocked out in the second quarter. 2 defensive starting linemen did not play, and Brock Vandagriff played his heart out, and so did Jamon Dumas-Johnson. The 2 signal callers had great familiarity with the Georgia offense and defense. I do believe that factored in. And conversely, Carson Beck didn't have his best night.
And, of course, we want to remind folks that it all has a chance to be better next Saturday at Alabama. And, of course, DawgNation's got a huge event getting ready for that. It's our DawgNation Invasion Tailgate. Why don't you be a part of that? Simply go to DawgNation.com/tailgate or our friends with Atlanta Sports Trips, and you can find out how you can be one of the first 150 to sign up. You get your DawgNation Invasion T-shirt. There's also travel packages, at least some limited travel packages for a night stay in Hoover before the game and the night of the game right there in Hoover, Alabama there as well. Luxury motor coach transportation back and forth from the hotel there too. A great, great experience when it comes to our DawgNation Invasion. And space is limited. It's time for you to get in there and be a part of that. DawgNation.com/tailgate for a lot more on that. We hope to see you in Tuscaloosa with us in our DawgNation Invasion next Saturday. So, Mike, with all that in mind, struggles against Kentucky, but as you said, and as I've pointed out, we've kind of seen that from Georgia before, and then better in the games that matter most. How do you get better? And as we get closer to it, I mean, this may be the biggest game of them all for Georgia for a million reasons. How does Georgia play better next Saturday against Alabama than it obviously played against Kentucky?
Yeah, Brandon, I'll actually be at that Friday night event before the game, so I'm really looking forward to talking to the fans and seeing everybody. I think Georgia should send Kentucky a thank you card. I think the best thing that could have happened was outside of the Rutledge injury was for Georgia to be put on notice, for these players, for Kirby Smart to have their attention, for Carson Beck to get the wake up call and look in the mirror, realize, wow, Brock Vandagriff outplayed me and motivated his teammates more than I motivated mine. Time to park the Lamborghini, time to get dialed in, time to bring the lunchbox. I mean, the season is on the line. Let's face it. You can lose a game and still make the playoff. Yes, I know that, Brandon. But you and I both know that there's not going to be a complete Georgia season without a win in Tuscaloosa. This is a game that Georgia's had circled for a long time. If you can't beat Kalen DeBoer, that's not a good sign. I think Georgia will win this game. I love the intangibles. I like what I heard from Trevor Etienne, Jazz Chambliss, and Jalen Walker last night. This is a team that is focused on fundamentals. This is a team that is hungry, that realizes backs to the wall. Georgia has not played their best game yet. We've seen one half of good football from the Georgia football team collectively. Now, that said, these dogs aren't just dogs. They haven't given up a touchdown yet. Kentucky ran 73 plays, BA, and they couldn't make more than 19 yards on any of them. And offensively, even though Carson struggled and dropped a ball that nobody was really around, they haven't turned the ball over yet through 3 games. We saw Trevor Etienne, what he can do, how he can put the team on his back. We saw Carson come up big in the clutch. Bobo dials it up. 33-yard completion, game on the line. That's one of those plays coaches always have saved and ready to go, a breaking tendency. So Georgia has gotten it done. Georgia has positioned themselves going into the bye week to be a hungry team, a focused team, and a team that will be ready and will show Alabama more speed and physicality than they've seen from the American Athletic Conference South Florida Bulls or the middling, mediocre, tame Badgers of Wisconsin that in no way, shape, or form resemble anything Luke Fickell coached at Cincinnati or Barry Alvarez at Wisconsin. 42-10 over a backup quarterback? That doesn't scare me. Georgia is going to be ready and loaded for bear. No pun intended, Alabama fans.
Well, Mike, we're looking forward to talking to you plenty more about that as we get ready for the game, and obviously seeing you in Tuscaloosa for our DawgNation Invasion event there as well. Thanks for your time here today, and we will see you soon back here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
Appreciate it, Brandon.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I think the Alabama game just looms so big for Georgia is because, look, obviously you can sustain a loss and still make the playoff. I think in the SEC you can sustain more than one loss and still make the playoff. But I think you want to kind of postpone as long as you possibly can anything that feels like a true must-win scenario. In other words, if you lose to Alabama, which obviously I don't even want to put that in the universe, but if you did, now you go to Austin with more pressure on you than Texas probably has on it, assuming they keep winning. But the flip side of that is, if you beat Alabama, all of a sudden now you've got Austin in a situation in October where now Texas, because they're playing at home, because Georgia by then will have kind of proven more in the SEC, all of a sudden in that particular game in October, maybe it's Texas who has the most pressure on it. I think a lot of the narrative for the remainder of the season for Georgia is going to be how long can you postpone feeling a great deal of pressure in what sort of approximates a must-win situation. Lose to Alabama, everything ratchets up after that. That's why it's so crucial that Georgia wins it. Now, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I'll remind you, we got Davin Bellamy here coming up in just a moment. A lot of fun to be had with him, and a lot of fun to be had on board Utopia of the Seas there as well. Great sailings taking place all the time out of Port Canaveral on their way to Perfect Day Coco Cay from Royal Caribbean when it comes to Utopia of the Seas. It's the newest in the Oasis class of ships. It's amazingly convenient for anyone here in the state of Georgia, the Atlanta area where I'm located. And Jessica Slater is a wonderful travel agent who can tell you how to be a part of it. Experience all the great neighborhoods, Central Park, the boardwalk, obviously the pool deck, the Royal Promenade. So many great things to experience on a ship that kind of redefines what it means to have family fun and everything else on board a wonderful, wonderful cruise ship. It is Utopia of the Seas. Jessica Slater can tell you all about it. Give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. All right, a couple of things here for a moment. We're not going to do our biggest talk on Tennessee, Oklahoma today. We're going to save that for the rest of the week, but it is a gigantic game on Saturday. And with Georgia not playing, I'm frankly looking forward to just sort of sinking my teeth in that and getting a chance to watch that as much as I possibly can. Let me give you a small thought for a moment. This doesn't really go into who wins the game, because the truth is I probably do, at least at first blush, kind of like Tennessee here on the road. The thing about where we are on the calendar right now, kind of moving towards the back half of the month of September, doesn't this feel like a very typical time in which throughout the years Florida has played Tennessee, Tennessee against Florida? And you'll know that's important because Florida has oftentimes been a real nemesis with the Vols. And we think about third Saturday in October being this marked date where it's always Tennessee against Alabama, but this portion of the calendar in September has very, very frequently been when Tennessee has also played Florida. And that has oftentimes, including last year, been a spot where Tennessee hasn't always been at its best. I think that's probably not all that consequential of a talking point going into this game on Saturday. But it's important to remember, with Josh Heupel this week coming across as a very confident coach because of how his team is playing, with all of that sort of taking place here, I think it's kind of interesting to know that oftentimes a little bit of a heat check for Tennessee during this portion of the year, and maybe you get that on Saturday at Oklahoma. Obviously, there's a lot of chatter about Heupel going back to Norman, the place that he was once a great quarterback. This is just a really fun game, and Tennessee has been one of the stories in the SEC thus far this year. So seeing them at Oklahoma, I think, is going to be a very big deal. Mike mentioned a moment ago that Tennessee announced yesterday it's also adding a 10% surcharge on its football tickets as kind of like a talent premium. They're going to use this money allegedly to pay the athletes. I think a lot of media types are getting duped on this here right now. Look, this is the same thing when you go buy a vehicle and there's a destination charge, or you go to the hotel and there's a resort fee or an activities fee. Every business out there in the world, and college football is a business like any other, they're always trying to find a way to raise their prices without losing business or generating a ton of complaints. College football is no different on this. Everybody would love to raise their ticket prices if they can. If you're Georgian, you've won 2 national championships, you've got a little bit of cover to kind of raise the cost of tickets because of the fact that you've been winning. Tennessee doesn't have as much of a history of winning in that regard. So therefore, at least recently, when they want to raise tickets, they have to have a good reason why. 10% surcharge going to the athletes. It's probably a pretty good PR pitch because almost everybody in the media bought it hook, line, and sinker. But all this is a ticket increase, and whether or not this 10% actually ends up in the pockets of the athletes or not, we'll never know. It's just from Tennessee's perspective, a good description for why they want to raise the cost of tickets, and it seems like they've probably gotten away with that. Now, I was going to do something on Billy Napier. Obviously, the headline here is the fact that he hasn't gotten fired yet, and the reason why he's not getting fired may be kind of interesting. I don't have a ton of time to do that here today, so let's push that off and save that for tomorrow and make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Before I say hello to our next guest, let me also give a shout out to our friends at the Finnish Long Drink here there as well. Getting ready for some fun times at home on Saturday. Not a tailgate, not an official watch party, at least when it comes to the Georgia Bulldogs, but the great taste of the Finnish Long Drink, whether it's any of the varieties, the traditional, the blue can, the grapefruit flavor, the gin kick, Long Drink Strong, 8.5% alcohol by volume, the Long Drink Cranberry, the special limited time offerings like the Long Drink Pineapple or the peach flavored version, which so many of y'all have loved. Great time to try the Finnish Long Drink, so make sure you do that today. Online, it's thelongdrink.com, and you can make that a big part of the weekend to come. And, of course, we'll see you Friday for our Long Finish here, presented by the Finnish Long Drink there as well. Okay, so with all that said, here on DawgNation Daily, let's also get ready to say hello to our next guest, the terrific former Dawg, always so entertaining. It's Davin Bellamy here on the program today. Davin, we're so glad that you're here. And obviously on Saturday night, we had a chance to talk to you about the win, and it was a win for Georgia against Kentucky, but perhaps not as impressive of a performance as some Dawg fans would have liked. You've had a couple more days to think about that since then. Any additional thoughts from you on kind of what Georgia did and maybe didn't show against Kentucky?
Man, kind of when I think about the game, the same thing that showed up in the Tennessee State game, that we kind of blushed over because it was Tennessee State. And like a coach always told me, you hide things in a win, but we gave up 100 yards to Tennessee State. And that's not like Georgia. That just shows that we weren't as physical as we needed to be against them. And you kind of thought it was because of the, opponent. But the following week kind of showed that I think we're not as physical as we used to be. That's definitely something we have to get back to because that's the only way you're going to win, in the SEC is being, physical. And I just thought when I rewatched the game, Kentucky was just more physical than us. And it seemed like they wanted it more. The only thing came down towards the end. And we have a team that's been in the national championship and the playoffs for, consecutive years. They just knew how to win the game and the other team didn't. But the physicality is kind of what, stuck out to me because that's not Georgia brand.
Well, let me ask you this, and I don't know. Obviously, you've got a lot more experience with this than I do as a player. You've got all the experience. I have none. But we did see a situation where, guys like Christian Miller and Nazir Stackhouse are having to play a lot of snaps because there is no Jordan Hall. There is no Warren Brinson. If you still count Mikael Williams as a defensive lineman to a certain extent, he's not playing either. As a Georgia fan, what I'm hopeful of is, okay, well, it's the additional fatigue the healthy players were forced to kind of take on that perhaps caused them to kind of give up some stuff late, and that with a full complement of defensive linemen, maybe that just improves just like that because you've got more healthy bodies in the game. How much of that you just described can be improved just by the additional depth that Georgia hopes to bring on?
You know what, Brandon, you made a great point. Depth is something that you need to go on a long run, in the football season. And especially on the D-line, you got a lot of guys, they're taking on, double teams. And by the fourth quarter, man, they get tired. That's 600 pounds just squeezing on them. But you kind of like to think that Georgia has the depth with all of the great recruiting classes that we had that, it's next man up. When one guy goes down, another guy can step up. So I definitely think kind of that is an issue a little bit to me, and it kind of warrants to what Coach Smart said before the season started about them lacking depth this year. I think we kind of saw that versus, Kentucky, because we're usually seeing, if one first rounder is down, then you at least got a first rounder right behind them. But I definitely think also the way our offense couldn't sustain drives at some point in time, it puts the defense right back on the field, when you're doing 3 and out and you're only on the field, for one series. So I definitely think if the offense can get it going a little bit more and just get us those first down, that gives your big boys on defense a break. So I think it's kind of like a combination of two.
What did you make of Georgia dropping from the number 1 spot? Texas overtakes UGA in the Associated Press poll. What was your reaction to that?
You really don't feed too much into that. I remember when we were number 1, it's such a high that you get from it. And, I kept making a joke about the Lakers are in town. Well, when the Lakers are in town, everyone's showing up in their best dressed and the fans are rocking, and you want to hear the beat LA chants at the end. That's how it is when you're the number 1 team. I mean, if we're the number 5 team rolling to Kentucky, it's that crowd that rambunctious. Our team's playing up to their standard times 10. So I definitely think it kind of, you want that notoriety of being number 1. But as of being in that, situation and us going to Auburn and just seeing how that was the craziest game of their season, being number 1, puts a target on your back. And you want to do it, but in the grand scheme of things is who's number 1 at the end. And I'm pretty sure that's what Coach Smart is. That's the message he's driving. We don't care about rankings inside the locker room, and he does his best to eliminate all that poison so guys aren't, feeding into it. But I definitely think from my experience, Coach Smart probably enjoys them not being number 1 right now.
Yeah, so that's what a lot of people have also kind of said. The assumption is, okay, well, maybe now for this team, it's extra motivation. All of a sudden now it's this thing of, okay, we were number 1, now you think we're not, so we're going to come out there and show you just how good we really are. Some kind of media types and fans have sort of talked that way. Do you think there's a chance this Georgia team does sort of feed off the doubt, kind of the opposite of the so-called rat poison?
Well, when you've been winning for so much, man, sometimes the best thing, for your stomach is some humble pie. So not saying that the Dogs were a cocky team, but, it's human nature when you win so much. We're a favorite every week. Everyone's expecting us to win by 21 points. And that's a lot of pressure, man, So some guys may love that pressure on the team, and then you got some guys that don't and like to move, under the radar. But I definitely think it'll give them some type of, okay, someone is doubting us now. Because at first, no one doubted Georgia. And sometimes you need that doubt just to kind of get you going. So I kind of think, man, this is definitely something that we're going to feed off of.
So got 2 weeks to get ready for a very big game at Alabama. How do you best use the extra time, both to get guys healthy, but also to be just sharper, just play better? I mean, to a certain extent, Georgia just needs to play better than it did last week. How do you make the best use of the extra week going into a game like this?
Well, I know when I was in school and we had to play against that Paul Johnson, Georgia Tech, offense, we always used to work on their offense during the week. Just kind of get like 2 days of working on cut blocks and seeing the wing tee. That's just something we did just because, you got that game, coming at the end. But as a far of right now, you don't really too much have to worry about that with Georgia Tech. It's kind of just basic, football. But another thing that we always worked on, definitely, and I think Georgia will do that this week, is, fixing your weaknesses. I definitely think just from being there and going through the bye weeks with Coach Smart, they're going to look at everything they did bad. And kind of like I mentioned last time, that running game, stopping the run has to be a priority if we want to get to where we want to get to. So there's not going to be, an off week. Coach Smart hears the media. He said he doesn't, but he hears it. And he's going to use that, for a physical upcoming week at practice. It isn't a bye week. It's a week to get better. So this is a week where you just sharpen your technique skills. You get back to the basics. It's ones on ones. It's not too much scout team going on. It's ones on ones. And let's get better through, iron sharpening iron. But as far as a bye week and the players having some time off, that's definitely not what's going on this week, especially after last week.
Let me give you one final question here, if you don't mind. So when I look ahead to the Alabama game, and I'm a Georgia fan, of course I want Georgia to win. Here's the one thing I'm sort of hopeful for. And I don't know that I'm going to get this, but this is what I'm hoping. Nick Saban's not coaching in this game. And listen, we can say what we want, but the honest truth is Nick Saban was a great coach. Everybody has to acknowledge that. So now in a game involving Georgia and Alabama that he's not coaching in, let me tell you what I'd love to see. I'd love to see a mistake from Alabama. I'd love to see some sort of reminder that the GOAT, the all-time great, is not on the Crimson Tide sideline. Whether it's, a late interception or some sort of late personnel problem or just some sort of, kind of sloppy moment that says, Saban's not there anymore. I mean, how big of a deal do you think it is that, Georgia's got to go to the hostile environment. They got to face the tough crowd. They got to face an Alabama uniform that's caused them trouble in the past. But Alabama doesn't have the coach that's been the architect of all of that. In other words, how big of a storyline do you think the absence of Saban is in a game like this?
You know what, Brandon, man, it's big. Now that I'm, out of school and I'm looking back on it, when you're playing Alabama, it's not too much of the name I don't want to say scared, but Nick Saban kind of had a psychological thing against us and the other coaches he's played, and you look at the stat where he's this crazy number in one against all the assistant coaches he's played. We hear that too. And kind of like I always say, it's a game of, adjustment. So even when you're playing Alabama and you go into halftime like we were in the national championship, you're not at ease because you understand that guy across the field from you is in the locker room making Hall of Fame adjustments. And the squad that he's leading out doesn't care about the score. They're built just like you. It's kind of like looking in the mirror of you, and this is going to be a heavyweight fight. But I definitely think with Coach Saban not being there, that psychological competitive edge that he had over his players, that we knew playing against them and how they were wired, that kind of goes away. Even when we went into the national championship of my year, we knew we were the better team. We knew we had the better players, but it's just that they got that golden goose over there that can just somehow tap into the minds of the players and get them to go an extra gear. So him not being there, the guys aren't going to say it, but it's not the same. Alabama, they don't have the same discipline that they had. They do give up big plays and have more penalties than they had last year. So you definitely see the Saban effect has already kind of taken a toll on this team. And it's definitely a psychological thing when he's, out there on that sideline. But now that he's not, it's red flags for them because they understand that, Georgia is the better team and we for sure have the better coach, the better program. And a lot of confidence is going into this weekend.
Davin, well said as always. Really strong stuff. We appreciate your thoughts on all of that. We'll give you a week off on Saturday, but we'll see you back here again, of course, on DawgNation Daily next week, and then we'll react after what we hope is a win for Georgia at Alabama 2 Saturdays from now. Thanks, as always, for your time. Thank you for your insight on Georgia football, and it's great to get the chance to speak to you here today.
Yes, sir. Sounds good, Brandon. Go Dogs, man.
Go Dogs indeed from Davin Bellamy. Really good stuff there. I love one of my favorite parts of the week is that conversation we get a chance to have with Davin Bellamy. I love what he brings to the table. Now, before we wrap it up today, let me also give a shout out to our friends at Lassiter Tractor here for a moment, because obviously Lassiter Tractor, a big part of our DawgNation game day, speaking of that, and a great resource for you when it comes to John Deere products. They're in the South Georgia area. They've been the South Georgia leader, the hometown for the John Deere dealer since 1956, right there. So whether that's one of those John Deere Series 1 tractors, if you've got, kind of a smaller property, maybe an acre to 5 acres, you want one of those Series 1 John Deere tractors, you can get that from Lassiter Tractor, or John Deere Series 2. If you're talking about something that's a little bit larger, maybe 10 to 15 acres of land, you're kind of a farmer, you got livestock, something like that, that is what you might need. John Deere Series 3, as the property gets a little bit bigger, and on you go. When it comes to those great John Deere tractors, the great John Deere equipment, our folks down at Lassiter Tractor taking good care of you on that when it comes to all of that. So please make sure you check them out today. It's online, Lassiter, that's spelled Lasseter, LassiterEQ.com. That's LassiterEQ.com, South Georgia's hometown dealer for John Deere since 1956. Great to have Lassiter Tractor as a part of DawgNation Daily. Our buddy Frankie Fibonacci, one of our great commenters on YouTube, always going back and forth with some of our rival fans in there, including a guy we call G. Grace, who's a big Alabama fan. So Frankie weighs in. Sometimes he'll use a golden shoe submission as a way of talking trash to a YouTube commenter. This is an example of that. Frankie writing to me saying, "Hey, DawgNation Daily, I found out why the guy we call G. Grace has been very quiet in the chat lately. And it's a little bit of a reminder that things right now not going great for Alabama quarterbacks in the NFL. Mac Jones, a total bust, is a first-round pick. All of a sudden, Jalen Hurts can't buy a win, including the Atlanta Falcons on Monday night. Bryce Young, you may have seen that he's been benched, the Carolina Panthers. And, of course, Tua Tagovailoa needs to learn how to slide. So you got all those issues here right now. Frankie says that for the Bama fans who watch our show, maybe that's made them a little quiet. If that's the case, then I guess we'll enjoy the silence here for a moment. Funny stuff from Frankie. We'll give him a golden shoe there on that. Lousy, stinking Gators. How about 1,411 days? That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. Who knows how much longer Billy Napier's going to be in the lives of the Gators fans, but we're going to be in their heads forever because Georgia owns that rivalry here right now, and we love it. That's our Gatorator Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S.Andrews Cool Down. R.S.Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can check them out on all of that. All right, we did not have comments yesterday, so my hope today is to give you a nice full comment section to make you feel like you got your money's worth here today. So let's do that here right now. I'm on YouTube, so let me just stay on YouTube here for a moment. G. Grace, who, by the way, is back with us. I thought I saw that G. Grace was leaving. Now he's back in here. He says, you goofy dog fans are just 1-5 against Bama. You can kick rocks, LOL. So, as I said before, I think the proper reframe on that is that in retrospect, given the fact that Nick Saban, as I said to Davin a moment ago, this is an all-time great coach. The fact that Kirby surpassed Alabama as a program while Nick Saban was still employed is a remarkable testament to where Kirby Smart may go from here. And I do think, listen, Georgia's got pressure going to Alabama on Saturday because while Nick Saban is not coaching, look, Kalen DeBoer still benefits from the Saban-like qualities that Alabama has. It's a good offensive line. They're healthier than they've been all season. There are pieces up front defensively. That's the kind of thing that in the Pac-12, DeBoer was never going to have. That there is still some line of scrimmage stuff from this Alabama that feels like a team that Nick Saban would have put together because by and large, that's what he did. So Georgia still has a grizzly bear to deal with. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But, gee, you can't tell me you're not a little bit nervous of having to do this game, this battle, without your ace card up your sleeve. And Nick Saban was a great coach in games like this. No doubt about that. No doubt about that. And without Saban, you can't tell me that the job of beating Georgia isn't made all the more difficult, because these kinds of coaches, what Kalen DeBoer is, feels a lot like a Mike Norvell or a Dabo Swinney or a Jim Harbaugh, even a Ryan Day. These coaches that lead programs outside the SEC. They may be the best in their respective leagues. They may be contenders for national championships, but they were all roadkill on the side of the highway after coming face-to-face with Kirby Smart. Is DeBoer any better, any more equipped? We'll find out 2 weeks from now. Let's see what else. Spencer Clark pointing out something really important here, that Beck said he knew he was coming back after the loss to Alabama in the SEC championship. His best is yet to come. I really believe that. It's one of the reasons why I really feel that in order to be able to celebrate the good times with all of you, to have credibility, to be allowed into your life when things are good for Georgia football, I have to earn that by being honest when things are not quite perfect. Does that make sense? That there's always an ulterior motive to, we're going to call balls and strikes around here, not because I'm trying to be objective, but because I just want to be truthful. And A, I think that lying's a very bad habit. But B, I think that lying is kind of disincentivized for me, because if I'm a liar, if I'm not telling the truth, then I'm not someone that means anything to you when something really, truly remarkable and exceptional happens for Georgia football. I want to have the credibility then to celebrate with you when all that good stuff is happening. And obviously we believe around Georgia football, there's always good stuff right around the corner, because why would you not think that? So if you have a situation where 3 games go by and, hasn't quite yet been perfect, then let me just sort of call it what it is. Hey, this probably would have been better. And if Carson was sitting here right now, I think he'd probably say that there as well. But as you said, when you look at what we learned about Carson last year, the fact that he did take that loss so hard and openly admitted that, well, then what a great time for him to have a really big breakout game next Saturday. I think you're exactly right about that. In addition to that, Jeff Sentell was pointing this out to me on the way kind of back to the hotel late Saturday night. We didn't get back to the hotel like 2:33 in the morning, late Saturday night. Just these games sometimes just get really, really late. But remember the video that Georgia shared? This is a really good point. After the South Carolina game, and it kind of gave, I think actually the SEC Network maybe the one that shared it. But it's the locker room video. Kirby's giving a speech, but like Beck at one point in time gets caught on camera, realizes he's on camera, and gives you a bit of a wink right there. Confident about the comeback that was to come. Have we seen the winking version of Carson Beck yet this year? Seems like we haven't seen as much of that. But getting that confidence back, he's had it before. He can clearly have it right now. Be a great time to bring that out. And as I pointed out a few times, this was a guy who really took on that mantle of leadership and really asked a lot from his players, his teammates, going into that Florida game last year. Calling back on some of that would be a very big thing to do. There's nothing that's happened for Georgia thus far this season that doesn't make me think, to use, I guess, a double negative, that Carson Beck can still have a very, very big season. But the overall performance needs to be improved from where it has been. I think that's probably true. By the way, Jay Shipes, at one point in time, we were worried about Jay, and now Jay's back in here again. Kenneth Holt says, I'm glad we faced a mobile quarterback before facing Jalen Milroe. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Is maybe, now I would say, obviously, Milroe is a different level of mobility and athleticism, but the overall point, it's true, is how you deal with Vandegrift is at least a little bit similar to how you deal with Milroe. I'd say that's the case. Roger Hall on DawgNation.com says, we certainly don't have a shortage of incentive to go in there and shut a bunch of folks up. Yeah, I mean, look, that's what makes college football so fun, is that everybody's always running their mouth. I am, you are, all of us are talking about this sport so much that there's always going to be that motivation of, well, I want to prove this guy wrong. I want to do this. I want to do that. And it just what makes the sport so fun is that the fact that we have all come together and agreed to make this a big deal. because ultimately it's only a big deal because we've all collectively decided that it is. So we've raised the stakes with our words to such a level now that, yeah, when you win, the kind of bragging rights you get in a game like that is pretty nice for sure. Senior Dog 54 says we'll have to scheme for Milroe. His athleticism demands that. Bama will run their defenses. We don't have anyone that requires special attention. I think he means standard operating procedure defense, because we don't have anybody that requires special attention. Much easier task defensively for Bama than what we're facing. It's not insurmountable, but certainly uphill. Yeah, but the name I keep coming back to is why haven't we seen more of Dylan Bell yet? And is that a guy that would require a little bit of a special game plan because of think about Tennessee game last year, because of all the kind of interesting and unique things he's capable of doing? Is that a guy that maybe Georgia has something special in mind for in this game coming up? You can't help but wonder. BMAX says, I was there at the SEC championship game last year, and Georgia just didn't look good. Let's change the narrative and go in confident. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I don't pretend to be smart enough to know why that game was so bad. Was it Georgia playing tight because of the opponent? Was it Alabama just having a better scheme? Was it some season-long issues that sort of caught up with Georgia at the wrong time? I don't quite know, but it's important to know. Georgia scored 24 points in that game. Texas last year to beat Bama scored 34. There's a huge line of demarcation between 20-something and 30-something. The difference between 20-something points and 30-something points is the difference between the sun and the moon. It's just gigantic. And obviously, LSU in 19 scoring 46, Ole Miss in 2015 scoring 43. Points to win when playing in Alabama. It seems like that's the only recipe. And for Georgia next Saturday, I see no reason why that's any different. Yard Dog says Davin Bellamy hit the nail on the head. We need our alpha dog, Mikael Williams, back. I agree. Let's see what else. Andrew Sisson says, I like Davin on this segment. He's correct in my opinion. UGA, he says, looks soft. All Georgia has to do is score one more point in their opponent each week. It's all about toughness, physicality, and will to win. He says it's now Kirby Smart's time to empower this team to get back for all the players on this team. Yeah, I sort of get some of that. I mean, and I'm not trying to downplay this, but we also would have thought Georgia looked soft for good portions of the 2022 season too. It's a very similar situation. Not quite perfect, but similar. Georgia beat Oregon 49-3, and then they beat South Carolina 1,000,000 to nothing. And then after that, y'all, Georgia didn't play good. My Northeast Georgia grammar is coming out. Georgia didn't play well for many weeks after that. They only scored 30-something points against an FCS team in Sanford that year. They got taken to the wire not taken to the wire. That's an exaggeration. It was closer than it was supposed to be against Kent State. They almost lost to Missouri. They were really kind of just sort of scuffling along. Kind of scuffling along. I mean, a lot of people thought they were going to get exposed against Tennessee. But everything that you wanted to see, boom, you saw it again. That somehow, some way, Georgia flipped the switch on to begin the season, flipped it off for a while, and then flipped it right back on when it mattered most. Then they flipped it back off again and barely beat Mississippi State, barely beat Kentucky. At least the first half was pretty bad against Mississippi State. And then got to the postseason, flipped it right back on, and steamrolled their way through almost everybody with the exception of Ohio State, which was a nail-biter. I don't know if you can just do that every single time. And maybe they can't do that here this year. But just keep in mind that it wasn't that long ago that Georgia was good against the good teams, not quite so good against everybody else. And maybe that suggests a possibility that could happen again. Although, admittedly, it's not always easy to do that. Blake Dasher says, is it just me, or does it seem like our wide receivers aren't getting any separation? Beck always having to throw into a tight window. So we said this back during the summer, that if you're the kind of person that sort of likes to sort of travel your way through the rumor mill, man, there was praise being heaped on the Georgia running backs. People saying nice thing about the Georgia tight ends. It was dead quiet about the wide receivers. Dead quiet. And when it comes to the rumor mill, as I've told you before, good news often leaks. And it is a sanctioned leak. Somebody close enough to the process feels good about letting this be known to somebody somewhere, and all of a sudden we become aware of it because it's just sort of fun to tell good news. But so-and-so showed up 10 pounds overweight, or so-and-so's, not performing up to capabilities. Bad news almost never leaks. So when there's silence around a topic, we're left to wonder, is this silent because it's not good news, or is it just not, being talked about? But it was noticeably quiet around the Georgia wide receivers prior to the start of the season. And we said that a couple of times. And I think you at least see some evidence from the on-field performance why perhaps there wasn't a lot of buzz about, oh my gosh, wait till you see so-and-so. There wasn't a lot of that. And perhaps now you sort of see why. But I believe all of this can possibly be fixed. Pre-snap motion and, certain ways to sort of scheme receivers open because, that's just sort of what football is. And if it is tight windows, the number one draft pick, Heisman candidate quarterback, throwing into tricky spots is just sort of what, a guy like that's kind of supposed to do. That you're looking around right now for where your Brock Bowers is. Carson Beck is sort of supposed to be your Brock Bowers. And so we'll see if he can be. I certainly believe he has a great chance to be that. Bill Radford asking about the point spread for Georgia against Alabama. It's important to note that while the AP poll voters had a huge overreaction to Georgia on Saturday, the odds makers will not. Georgia's still going to be about a touchdown favorite against Alabama. Maybe a little bit more. Maybe it settles down to being a little less by the time the game is played. But something right around, I said touchdown, not a touchdown, not a touchdown, not a touchdown. A field goal favorite, excuse me, not a touchdown. Sorry. Georgia will not be a touchdown favorite at Alabama. They will be about a field goal favorite. Now, obviously, 3 is a very key number. It is a very common margin of victory, so slightly above or slightly below certainly matters from a gambling standpoint. But we're not talking about, necessarily betting right now. We're just talking about projections. Georgia will be projected to beat Alabama by about a field goal or so, which would translate to about a 6-point, almost touchdown favorite if they were playing on a neutral field. But in Tuscaloosa, Georgia will be about a field goal favorite there. Let us see what else. Robert Evans says you got to first open up the passing game, then the running game is going to excel. I do think that's what football is now. I really do. It used to be the thought of, well, you got to establish the run, and then once you establish the run, now you can throw the ball. In fact, that's what the whole idea of like play action passing is predicated on, is like once they trust your run, now when you play action pass, they'll key on the run, you can throw over it. But a lot of these math nerds in the NFL have crunched the numbers, and they feel like they've got definitive proof that you don't have to establish play action pass. I should say, you don't have to establish the run for play action passing to work. The play action passing works whether you've established the run or not. Now, listen, I'm not a calculator, so I can't tell you if that's true, but the math nerds will tell you that's absolutely definitively proven to be true. This notion of you got to pound the rock between the tackles for 2 yards in a cloud of dust so your play action pass will work. No, that's not what history suggests. That's not what the data suggests. So I think that Robert's absolutely right about this, is that in the sport now, it's about creating space, creating running lanes, spreading out a defense, making them be put into a situation where they've got to make a tackle in the open field, playing you in space, never an easy thing for a defender to do. And so, from that standpoint, throwing the ball first to sort of set that up probably makes a lot of sense. Matt Rukavina, the very wise and studied man, says, as Napoleon once said, when you're going to take Vienna. He says, I feel like that needs to be our run game philosophy. Don't RPO it, just smash it. Yeah, to a certain extent, I think that's probably true. I also think, and I hope to the Lord I'm right about this, I think there's a lot more from the running game we haven't seen. I think they really wanted not to play Nate Frazier last week. And listen, I love Kirby to death. We all do. I think for the most part, he's well within his rights to conceal what he wants to conceal when it comes to having a competitive advantage. But the thing that he says, and I say this with as much respect as I possibly can have, the thing that he says that is the absolute most meaningless thing on the planet to me, not saying it's always wrong, but it's just not always right, is, oh, yeah, we think so-and-so could have gone back in the game. Like, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But I don't find myself very convinced often by we feel like so-and-so could have gone back in the game. But that's what he said about Nate Frazier after Tennessee Tech. And then, Frazier never did appear on the availability report last week, which is not any of my business. That's between Kirby and the league. I don't even really care that much about it. But then Frazier doesn't play in the first half, and maybe that was just a coach's decision. But then when ETN got banged up, all of a sudden now, Frazier does kind of attempt to give it a go. I think it's fairly obvious they were trying to play that game without playing Nate Frazier. So maybe in 2 weeks, maybe his shoulder's a little healthier, and maybe ETN is too, and Branson Robinson will be a little bit farther along then too. I really do think there's a chance this running game's got a lot more in store than what it's shown here thus far. Blake Dasher says, I've always thought that Bobo was a good play caller that needs elite wide receivers to make him look good. He doesn't seem to be able to scheme guys open like Monken could. We can obviously still win with Bobo, but the wide receiver play looked like they needed some help to get open. Yeah, so, on the subject of Monken, look, I don't try to pretend like I know more than I do. I don't. But to me, one of the things that I think good offensive coordinators do, and this is one of those things that Blake was talking about. Let me plug in. Hold on. One of those things that I think that good offensive coordinators do is they do a bunch of stuff before the snap. A lot of guys moving around, a lot of pre-snap stuff taking place, motion. Defenses are all in disarray. They're having to move around. And somehow, some way, that seems to make up for some issues at wide receiver. That there is a way just to scheme guys open. The pick plays, the rub routes, the things like that. Just a way to get a receiver more open than he could get himself with just straight line speed. And it does seem, I can't draw it up on a chalkboard. I couldn't talk about it. It does seem that Monken was just really good at that. Todd Monken, I believe, is probably the best offensive coordinator Georgia's ever had. And it may be the best offensive coordinator Georgia ever will have. Monken came here at a time in which his professional prospects, I think he had sort of worn out his welcome in the NFL. Part of that was, I think, because obviously the results in Cleveland weren't great. I think Monken also did a couple of things shocking when you go back and listen to his interviews, a little bit of an abrasive personality. I think Monken may have done a couple of things in the NFL that rubbed some people the wrong way. And I think that Todd Monken had a little bit of a hard time getting a job because of that. This is all just my best guess. It just is. So Monken, who wanted to be in the NFL, needed a little bit of a career rehabilitation. So why not come to a place like Georgia? They need an offensive coordinator. I can be good, play a bunch of games on TV, and I can go back to the NFL. And that is exactly what happened. It was a transactional relationship. Georgia needed a good OC. Monken needed a better line on his resume. Both parties shook hands when it was over, and they've gone on to the next phase of their life in the aftermath of all that. Monken was a really, really good offensive coordinator. Now, I believe that Mike Bobo is also a really good offensive coordinator too. I just think that his result last year, his result in his final year at Georgia in 2014, for instance, I think those are pretty good seasons. However, I do think it is a significant challenge to be as good as Monken was. I just do. I think that Mike Bobo is capable of that. But as the commenter said, being as good as Monken is not easy because Monken was dadgum good. at being the offensive coordinator. So because I'm not a former coach and I don't really know the objectives of a formation and a play, all I can really do is judge the results. But honestly, that's all that really matters to me anyway. I almost don't even care about the extra information. Like, have you ever heard the phrase, don't tell me about the birth pains, just show me the baby? I'm a little bit like that when it comes to this, about like, you know, what schematically were you trying to do and what is Carson Beck checking in of, checking out of, and blah, 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 blah. I love football, but some of the football ease part of it, just the really like nuts and bolts part of it, I don't really care. I really don't. Just show me the results. And Monken's results, big point totals in big games. Last season at Georgia, 50 against LSU in the SEC Championship, 40-something against Ohio State in the Peach Bowl, 65 against TCU in the National Championship. For Mike Bobo last year, just being fair, in the SEC Championship game against Alabama, for a number of reasons, Georgia did not have a very impressive point total. And as I mentioned earlier, the difference between 20-something and 30-something is kind of a lot. So for the Bobo critics who are out there, and I'm not in that category. I'm not a Bobo critic. But for the Bobo critics who are out there, I think the response to that criticism is a positive result against Alabama. And that's just how the game works, is it's a results business. If Mike goes into Tuscaloosa and hangs something starting with a 3 on the board, then he's done his job, I believe. And at that point in time, he will be giving you a performance that is certainly in keeping with what Todd Monken probably could have done as well. And if not, then that criticism is probably only going to grow louder. Does that seem fair? I mean, does that seem, I know that's kind of a long-winded answer, but does that seem like a fair way of looking at all this? Let me go back around here. Lance D says Bobo's offensive stats are great, but what are they in the biggest games? Yeah, I am totally willing to acknowledge that when you average 40 for the season but only score 24 in the elimination game, what turned out to be the elimination game, that's going to be a little bit of a red flag. I don't have a problem with that. I don't. Now, I would also suggest that, as tried as it sounds, nobody's perfect, and after 30 straight wins, you know, a bad game can occur. But if it happens again, now you got a little bit of a trend starting to form, right? So in the game that mattered most, Georgia wasn't as good offensively as it had been being. I don't have a problem saying that. That's why you need more results here this year to kind of respond back to that. And the good thing is, you know, these Georgia coaches all understand that. I mean, they know why it is they're paid the big bucks, and that's also part of the reason why they, you know, kind of build a little bit of a moat around themselves. I mean, just being honest here is that, you know, we don't hear a ton from Georgia coaches. You know, they kind of stay huddled into their, you know, facility because, you know, they feel like that the average person doesn't understand, you know, all of this, and so therefore the criticism doesn't matter very much. At least that's the sense that you sometimes get. And maybe that's true, but ultimately, you know, when you kind of step outside the bubble of that and sort of look down on it, you know, it's, to use another kind of, I guess, corny analogy, you know, it's been said that we want other people to judge us on our intention. In other words, if I'm late for work, I want people to judge me on my intention. Well, I was trying to be here on time, but I ran into traffic or this and that. We like for people to judge us on our intentions. What were we trying to do? But what we have a tendency to do is judge other people on their results. In other words, this guy's not good because he's always late. This person's bad because blah, 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 blah. We want to be judged on our intentions. We have a tendency to judge others on their results. I'd say the football coaches sometimes the same way. They understand their intentions, what a play was intended to do, what they were intending to do with their overall philosophy. But fans have a tendency to fixate on results. And I don't think either side's necessarily wrong. All right, a couple of final comments here. Johnny Surfdog says that Kirby is anti-deep pass. I mean, I don't know that's necessarily the case. I mean, wasn't one of the criticisms of Stetson at one point in time that he didn't throw any intermediate routes? wasn't that a thing at one point in time that all he did was, shot plays? I think that was, didn't that criticism live on the internet for a minute? I don't know. I mean, Scott Pete says, I love Bobo. He says, who are you going to get that's better? And I mean, but here's one thing I'll say is that Mike Bobo definitely has a resume worthy of this job. Absolutely does. Absolutely Mike Bobo has a resume worthy of this job. I think it's really important to understand that he wasn't just tabbed for this role because he's Kirby's friend. I think that Kirby likes having people that he trusts close to him, and I think those of us who like Kirby want him to be comfortable and happy, and that gives you that. But given Bobo's original track record as Georgia offensive coordinator, given what he did last year, Bobo has a resume worthy of this job. Now, you, of course, need better results than what you've gotten. I am absolutely willing to entertain that conversation. You need better results. But he's got a resume worthy of this job. And this is going to make it sound like I'm his attorney, but when you look at 1 year at South Carolina, 1 year at Auburn, I think most of us would also say there were some pretty intense mitigating factors, extenuating circumstances around both of those jobs, I believe. Alex Waller says, I can't wait to see BA's prediction for the Bama game. Well, to be fair, I did say this the other day, which is my predictions on Georgia games here thus far, which, I mean, I obviously get plenty wrong, but I have been precisely accurate on everything I've said about Georgia here thus far. The problem with that is those were all based on Georgia playing games pretty typical to what they've done in the past. The season now gets pretty atypical the rest of the way. Georgia's only played at Alabama once in the regular season during the Kirby Smart era, and that was during the pandemic. The schedule much tougher than anything Georgia's ever played after that. So if I'm using kind of established templates for assuming how Georgia's going to play, there isn't much of an established template for what's going to happen in these future games. Doesn't mean we won't have a strong prediction, kind of working on that here right now. But as correct as I've been, I'm also humble enough to sort of pump the brakes on, certainly if I were to come out here and tell you, I'm about to get the next 6, Georgia games right too. Look, that's not the way this works. It's just not. And it's one of the reasons why I like making picks on games. Here's what I believe. The only thing truly interesting when it comes to sports talk is a prediction. That if we're just talking but we're not leading to some sort of prediction, then it's just a bunch of hot air. That all of our sports talk should lead to, this is what I think is going to happen. But in the midst of making predictions, while it's fun to make a forceful prediction because that's what people can more easily understand, I don't have any misgivings of a belief that my predictions are going to be any more right than anybody else's over the course of time. It just happens that I've gotten a lot of stuff right with Georgia here thus far this year, but I can promise you that's not likely to continue forever. Let us see what else. We got to get ready to go. We have gone long today, so in fairness for no comments yesterday, we've gone long today. All right, back at Dawg Nation one more time. Randy Hall checks in to say about still being employed there at Arkansas. Yeah, it's a weird situation, obviously. I mean, Arkansas is trying to do everything it can. I think Arkansas-Auburn on Saturday is a really wild game. A really wild game. A very wild game. Randy Hall also mentioning that Tito Jackson passed away. Is that one of the Jackson 5? Is that right? I like Jackson 5 music. I don't have a ton on Tito necessarily, but I do like the Jackson 5. Amazing. It's amazing how good of a singer Michael Jackson was from that era. Like, amazing, right? And I guess that's kind of before his, voice completely changed or whatever. But still, like, how many people, I mean, obviously Michael goes on to be an amazing performer, but at that stage of his life, when he was like singing for the Jackson 5, how many people have ever sang better than that? That's crazy. That's crazy. Richard D says, don't be humble, BA. Trust your instincts, young Padawan. The force is strong with you. Well, I appreciate that, Richard. I appreciate that. Let's see what else. Final comments here. Anything else on Facebook before we go? Malcolm McEacher wondering if we're going to have to, he says, beat the officials like we did back in the days of Nick Saban. I'm not sure about that. I do want to talk about officiating at some point this week because officiating has been a hot topic, but I think there's something actually going on in the officiating that almost no one is noticing. And I think since we've got some time here this week because there's no game on Saturday, officiating has been a very big deal. After the Georgia game, I know what's-his-face from 24/7 was talking about it a little bit, but there's actually something else going on with officiating that I think that people are not noticing right now, which I believe is a much bigger deal. And so we may talk about that this week if we get a chance. Hopefully we will. All right. We're going to get ready to go for today. Thank y'all for being here. Appreciate that. Y'all check out R.S.Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. That is what R.S.Andrews is all about. That means air conditioning. Do y'all know that by the end of the weekend, like you have this like day like Monday where it's kind of fall. No. We're back to 90 again, I believe, by the time the next week is probably done. So that means AC is still cranking them out like always. So make sure yours is still up and running and ready to go. Get it tuned back up to factory first specs. Our friends at R.S.Andrews can help you out with that. So find them online at rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. Showing up on time, doing the work that's promised, the price is promised. That is what R.S.Andrews is all about. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll talk to you then.